All right, so to go over what we went over last video, um, we went over integral types, which is basically whole numbers as opposed to a floating point. We went over data types, and these basically create or manipulate memory. We went over primitive data types, the integer, the char, the bool, the float, and abstract or user-defined data types. Um, so these are like classes, structs, all of these things. Then we went over specifiers, which is they modify the meanings of the basic built-in types and expand upon them. So these are the long, the short, the signed, and the unsigned. And then we went over the short and the long specifier, which basically modify the minimum and maximum values that a data type will hold. And last but not least, we went over the size hierarchy for floating point numbers, which is float, double, and long float. So now we will move on to new vocabulary words, if you will, so that we could speak in the language of C++. So the first word I'm going to start out with is an identifier. This is a very basic word, but it makes, like, you could call a thing, or you could call a thing by its name. And if you're talking professionally, using the right name for things just makes more sense, and it helps you out on code reviews, and it helps you sound more professional and get your raises, blah, blah, blah. So an identifier is one of those simple things that if you use a name, and also more than anything, it helps everybody be on the same page. So an identifier is a named, so here, let me write this down, identifier. What's wrong with me right now? Beep. Oh, my hands were wrong on the keyboard. Identifier. So an identifier is a name used to identify anything, basically a variable, a function. If you're using an abstract type like data type like a class, a module, or any other user-defined item. An identifier starts with, so you have like a couple of parameters of how you are supposed to name an identifier, because this is user-defined. So it starts with the letters A through Z, and either that or an underscore. So A through Z or an underscore. Oops. A through Z or an underscore. And it also is followed by 0 or more letters, underscores, and digits from 0 to 9. So this is an identifier. You could use it to name anything, basically, a variable, a function, a class, a module, or any other user-defined item. And this is what you would call, for example, a function. This is my identifier. So next important word to know would be a directive, or less commonly pragma. So a directive is like, it is a language construct that specifies how the compiler or other translator should process its input, right? So directives are not necessarily part of the grammar of a programming language, but they do help you program, and they may vary from compiler to compiler. They could be processed by a preprocessor to specify compiler behavior, right? So a preprocessed directive are usually lines that include the hashtag. So anything that has a hashtag usually, apparently that doesn't do that, huh? A pre-hashtag. So anything that has a hashtag is usually a preprocessor directive, right? And and the code of these lines are not program statements, but directives for the preprocessor. The preprocessor examines the code before the actual compilation ever begins and resolves all these directives before any code is actually generated by its regular statements. These preprocessor directives extend like only across a single line of code, and as soon as a new line character is found, the preprocessor directive it ends, and there's no semicolon needed, and it's expected at the end of a preprocessor directive. Like, so you don't need a semicolon like you usually do for anything else. I guess that's not there either. All right, so you don't need a semicolon. So you don't need a semicolon. So this is a directive or a preprocessor directive. Just to give you guys an example, one preprocessor directive might be, pound include, so the include. Figlet won't let me do a hashtag, or I haven't tried to figure out how to get it to do that yet. But imagine that this has a hashtag in front of it. And that basically, this preprocessor directive would go in, grab whatever included is, and paste it in where you want to do. And this is all handled by the preprocessor. So the next word that we're going to cover would be a literal. So a literal in computer science is a notation for representing a fixed value in source code. So if you could hear something, for example, in a coding question that do a string literal, and basically what this means is that there's a string and it has a fixed value, fixed amount of bytes, and this is why it's called a string literal as opposed to a string. So all of these things, so now we've kind of talked about abstract or user-defined types and like identifiers and a little bit about functions. We really haven't gotten into that. But all of this, when you actually see C++ code, would be contained within what the next vocabulary word is, which is a translation unit. So this is actually important. And now we're starting to get into less basic words and things that, actually define how C++ works and the mechanisms of it. So a translation unit, it's the basic unit of compilation in C++. It consists of the contents of a single source file. So like if you have a CPP file, with the H file attached to it. So it consists of a single source file plus the contents of any header files directly or indirectly included by it. So a translation unit, if you have a C++ file called car.cpp, and then you have the H file for it, then the translation unit would take the car.cpp file. It's represented the CPP file in every single H file. If you have more H files, pound defines in it. So that would all encompass your translation unit. So minus the lines that were ignored using conditional preprocessor statements, obviously. And a single translation unit can be compiled into an object file, a library, or an executable program. So it can be compiled into an object file, a library, or an executable program. And the notation of a translation unit is most often mentioned in the context of like the one definition rule, which we'll get into later, or templates or whatever. So we'll just leave off in there. Actually, I'll go one more word. So this one's a simple one. So like just one that's if you hear like the body. So the body inside of a C++ is the collection of statements enclosed in braces. That's it. So if you see the body of this function is just talking about from this brace to that brace, that would be, you know, that would be the body of whatever you need. So yeah, that's it. We'll end on that for now.